Again,
we do our best.
I'm sorry for how long it's taken to get to you, but there has been a lot of talk today about how Rashid Redouane got... We don't know how he got into Ireland, but we know he got here after being refused asylum in the UK in 2009. He got married here, which allowed him to get this EU FAM4 card, a residency card, which allowed him then to get back into the UK. And a lot of concern being raised about how that happened. Do you think that that system should be looked at as a result, or is that something that we have to accept as a result of the residency rules and the immigration rules we have in this country?
Firstly, I want to offer my condolences to the families and the victims of the attacks in the UK, and to indeed families and victims of terrorism across the world. We have a very rigid and onerous immigration system. We have a huge amount of checks and balances in place. Indeed, it's actually very, very hard to migrate to the country. We do have free movement for EU nationals. So we do have a lot of checks and balances in place already. My concern is really about the knee-jerk reaction as well to attacks like this. What we've seen now is an attack on the Muslim community in Galway, and I would offer my solidarity to that group of people as well who are now being victimised. We will see increased levels of racism, Islamophobia in the country, and we really have to tackle that. That's something that I think is really central to all of this. We don't have any hate crime legislation in the country. We've had cuts to our communities which have decimated communities across the country, cuts to the Gardaí, cuts to everything. So what we really need to do is invest in our communities, invest in our community infrastructure, invest in community policing. We need to invest in our communities and work with communities if we're serious about the integration of people and if we're serious about looking at this in any particular way. So from our perspective, you know, what we see on a daily basis, I mean, we work with the Muslim community and women who work in very difficult circumstances providing services for their community, who are egged on a daily basis because they look different. If you're visibly different in this country, you're going to be subject to racism and discrimination. We do not have a national action plan against racism in this country, and that's a scandal. We haven't had one for years. If we're serious about creating the conditions for people's integration, we have to be clear about protecting people as well. We have to be clear about upholding people's human rights, and we have to look at other avenues in terms of solutions going forward.
All right. So that is, and I think that's an aspect that most people would agree with. It's very difficult to disagree that there should be further funding and resources put towards integration. But what then about the point, for example, made by Umar Al-Qadri, who's from the Irish Islamic Centre today, that he believes that Ireland is a safe haven for radical extremists, and that he knows people living in Ireland who are publishing extreme views on social media, for example, on Facebook, etc. What do you think should be done with those people in terms of how the Gardaí should approach it? Should they be watched? Should they be interned? Should they be warned? Like, what level of surveillance or level of treatment, in terms of civil rights, I suppose, should we afford them?
Well, we should absolutely not roll back on people's civil rights and human rights. I mean, that's a given. And we have a very distinct history.
We have a civil right to be protected in this country as well.
We have a very distinct history of terrorism in this state and response to conflict. When we put particular communities under surveillance, and when we push them aside, that's not the answer either.
So what is the answer with those people? If we take that example of those people, we know, for example, there's a small group of people already under surveillance by the Gardaí who they regard as very extreme and a threat. But we also know now from Umar Al-Qadri today, there's this other group of people operating at a much lower level of extremism, but they're showing signs of radicalisation. What do you do with those people?
Well, as I say, we have to look at community policing. We have to look at how you get into communities, how you talk to people, how we talk in a way that creates dialogue and openness with communities. That's really not rocket science. That's something that we've learned throughout the peace process. When we have dialogue, when we're in communities, when we know communities, and when we work with communities, and it's really, really important in terms of equality and in terms of how we look at integration and how we measure integration in this country.
Frank Reedy, is that the way to approach it?
Yeah, but there are other...
Here, do you think it should be changed?
I have a problem with what we have in Europe. I'm just back from Sicily, where I observed firsthand a reception centre. And the truth of the matter is, these most unfortunate people being picked up in the Mediterranean are landed at the nearest safe port. They arrive without any form of identification or paperwork. during the reception period, they can give any name they want. There is no way of verifying. And without a civilian intelligence service, we are outside the intelligence club.
So what do you do with those people?
I think this is a massive problem, not just for Ireland, but for Europe.
I know that, but what do you do?
I have not been able to come up with a solution to how we monitor them, other than something like what Frank is talking about, where the ID card system is used similar to the way it was used in South Africa, and that's not really a place we want to go in this country, because then you're infringing on human rights of people, their freedom of movement around the country. But there is a security issue for a tiny, tiny number. But if you were to put...
So do you affect the masses because of the tiny number, the masses who need asylum, who need refuge?
Well, that's a good question, but the point is, if you were to put...
What's the answer?
If you were to try and observe these people 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the rough cost is €1 million per person. We couldn't...
All right, Edel, final word.
We can't conflate the need for people seeking protection and asylum with terrorism. That is just absolutely ludicrous, and it's wrong. And I don't want anybody or any viewer here tonight to actually conflate the two together, because that's just not actually the way it is.
You're saying you don't accept there's any risk that among the thousands there could be the one or the two?
I'm saying that when we conflate this discussion and this debate around people seeing refuge and protection in this state with terrorism, that we're doing a disservice both to refugees, and we're not actually tackling terrorism. We're talking about something else. We're actually talking about racism, and we're spouting xenophobic views, and that is just not the case at all.
Jared, you just want to reject that?
Totally. I mean, totally. We are going to have difficult conversations.
All right. Okay.
Absolutely.
The fact should be remembered as well that the immigration services here are in constant contact with their colleagues across the water, and they have a system whereby they can check
not
the
with MI5.
Oh, they have.
All right.
They have, in fact, and they have fingerprinting, and they have quite a sophisticated system that is operational all the time.
All right.
I think if we stop investing in war, maybe that's where the solution lies.
Okay, thank you all. We're going to have more after the break. We're going to be talking about Leo Varadkar and his new cabinet.